3, 2, 1. We're live.
Hello and welcome to virtual Red May 2020. It's our second Red May that we've at least planned this year. We spent 6 months putting together a live Red May, and the last 2 weeks trying to turn it into a virtual Red May. So before we talk a little more about birth strike with Jenny Brown and Katherine Armitage, let me guide you through what's on tap for the next week. Tomorrow night at the same time, 6 p.m., we have Carceral Capitalism, which is the name of a book written by Jackie Wang. Should be interviewed by Dan Berger, who's the author of Captive Nation. On Friday night, we have a panel called Thinking the Pandemic, Capital or Life, and that has Asad Haider, Cinzia Aruzza, Michael Hart, Rodrigo Nunez, Sarah Mason, and it will be moderated by Keaton Slansky. On Saturday, in the afternoon at 1 p.m., Jenny Brown will be back with us for House Arrest into the hidden abode of women's work. And Jenny's going to be joined by Kathy Weeks, who will moderate, Kathleen Reeves, and Liza Featherstone. But now, and I guess before I introduce this panel, I do want to say one thing about how Red May funds itself and what you might do to help us have other Red Mays in the future. We put everything on a credit card at the beginning of the month, and then during all our live performances at Red May, where we have panels and so forth, I go out, hold up the credit card and say, this is what we've spent, and we'll try to, let's see if we can pay it all back in a month. And amazingly, we did it last year. We can't do that this year because no live events to kind of stoke up the crowd. We do have an incredible airline bill. And tomorrow, I'm actually going to start negotiating with the airlines to see what they'll give back, since most of them have canceled their flights. And I'm going to bet that they're going to give nothing at all and just maybe at best a ticket for next year. So we have a lot to pay off. So if you're feeling good after sitting in on a few of these events and would like to see more of them, go to Fan the Flames of Red May, or go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and click on the part where it says donate and give us your cash. But now let's talk about Birth Strike. It's the name of a book by Jenny Brown. Jenny is a National Women's Liberation organizer and a former editor of Labor Notes. She was a leader of the grassroots campaign to make morning after pill contraception available over the counter in the US. And she's the author, as I said, of Birth Strike, The Hidden Fight Over Women's Work from PM Press, and recently from Verso, Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle Now. We're happy to have been able to get Katherine Armitage to interview Jenny. Katherine has been in socialist organizing in Seattle for a long time. That's where we met. She's a founding member of the DSA Queer and Feminist Caucus, and she was co-chair of the DSA. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Katherine and Jenny.
Thanks, Philip. I guess we could start off, Jenny, if you want to just share a synopsis of Birth Strike and your thesis, and then we can go from there. We can have some discussion, and then we'll be taking questions from people as well.
Great. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Phil, and thanks, Katherine, and everybody who's behind the scenes working on this. So as you just heard, I worked with a group, my group, National Women's Liberation, from 2003 to 2013 on a campaign to try to make the morning after pill, which is basically after sex contraception, available over the counter without a prescription in the US. And dozens of other countries had this when we started. But when, thanks to our campaigning and lawsuit, the FDA finally recommended making the pill over the counter for all ages, which had been our demand, the administration of newly elected President Barack Obama overruled it. He said he didn't want his young daughters to be able to buy the pill. So we were kind of surprised that the Obama administration joined this attack on the morning after pill. I mean, we had grumbled about the Democratic Party, but it still seemed to largely support reproductive rights. And here we were talking about a contraceptive. So when we started the campaign, I was working for the Red Stockings Women's Liberation Archives, and we launched a project to try to examine more closely how it was that opposition to birth control had become mainstream politics again in the United States. We looked at the history of birth control in the US, which has throughout our history been opened up and then restricted and opened up and restricted. We looked at the dropping US birth rate and some of the establishment reactions to it. We looked at the situation in other countries, and then we also looked at our own experience of having and raising children or deciding not to. And so I'll just give a little bit of what we found, and then we can go into more detail in the discussion. You know, for decades, we've been told that abortion is a wedge issue used by Republicans to split working class Catholics away from the Democratic Party. It's used to excite a Protestant evangelical base, we're told. Feminist law professor Joan C. Williams explained recently, quote, starting in the 1970s, Republicans have offered support for working class anti-abortion views in exchange for working class support for pro-business positions. So you've heard this story. According to this view, politicians and the 1% really don't care one way or the other about abortion, but they're using the issue to get votes. So we looked at the history, and in 1873, when birth control was completely banned along with abortion, the chief reason given then was that the birth rate had been declining. Married women were quote unquote, avoiding the duties and responsibilities of married life, resulting in smaller families. The family size went from 8 children per woman in 1800 to 4 women per children per 4 children per woman in 1900. So it had dropped by half in 100 years. Political elites feared that women were abandoning their child rearing work to go out and get jobs. They worried that Protestant native-born women were using abortion to limit births, while Catholics and recent immigrants were having lots of children. An Ohio Senate Select Committee convened in 1867 asked, quote, shall we permit our broad and fertile prairies to be settled only by the children of aliens, unquote? So if not, the committee said, you know, native-born women must be convinced to not have abortions by making the practice illegal. Skip forward 150 years, and the US birth rate has dropped below replacement. It's now considerably below the 2.1 children per woman required for a stable population. And in fact, it's now at a record low. It has dropped since I wrote the book, so it's now at 1.72. And as in the 1870s, the US answer has been immigration. But to make up for the current drop, we need to have something like 3 times the immigration we have now. And immigration, at any rate, is a displacing of the work and costs of having and rearing children onto other mothers and other parents in other societies, all for the benefit of employers in the United States. As corporate apologist Ben Wattenberg put it gleefully many years ago, immigrants are men and women who have been raised and educated on someone else's nickel. So he was sort of letting a truth go there that we don't ordinarily talk about, because ordinarily around immigration, we're talking about, oh, how grateful people should be to be able to immigrate to the United States. Then we compared our situation to Europe, where the birth rate is as low or lower than the US in many countries. We found that there it's openly discussed as a problem by politicians and newspapers, and then efforts to raise the birth rate have mostly focused on making it easier to have children. either by fully funding childcare or providing long paid leaves or child allowances. And you hear all kinds of people exhorting their populations to have more children. In some places like Turkey and Poland, leaders attack reproductive rights with the open goal of raising the birth rates. And then in others like France and Sweden, where maybe the feminist movements are a little stronger, governments are promoting policies that support parenting, and they've experienced actually higher birth rates as a result. Some countries like Russia are doing both. They're increasing maternity leave and government payments to parents at the same time that they're gnawing away at abortion and contraception. But in all cases, the reasons for the policy are out in the open. How can we get women to make more babies? Here, it's not really that open. And when they ask that question, they often come to an answer that kind of echoes feminists. Equality at work is one way to get folks to have kids. Stefan Kronert, a Berlin demographer, explained, quote, "For a long time, politicians said that the high participation of women in the labor market is responsible for the low birth rate, because when women go into the labor market, they don't have children anymore. But interestingly, when you look at Western European countries, the fertility rate is higher in countries with a higher labor market participation of women." So, and then referring to the difficult conditions for German parents with school days that end at noon and little childcare provision, Kronert said, quote, "Women who decide they want a modern life with financial independence and their own professional career are very often deciding to have no children at all. The lack of childcare makes women dependent on their husbands, and most women don't like this," unquote. In an article called "Breaking the Baby Strike," The Economist explained the falling birth rate in Turkey this way, quote, "Ask Turkish women about work and motherhood, and the response is a torrent of grievances. Husbands do little housework, employers are unsympathetic. In short, mothers are generally still expected to stay home, and until that changes, Turkish women will perceive a sharp choice between work and parenthood, and often go for the first." US journalist Stephanie Mensimer has put it more bluntly. She says, "Conservatives thought that if they only make it harder for mothers to work, women would stay home. Instead, women stopped having kids." Well, in my group, National Women's Liberation, the falling birth rate made perfect sense to us. I mean, many of us were in our 30s when we started looking at this question. We could clearly see how the difficult conditions that we faced were causing us to decide to have fewer children. And in a consciousness raising meeting in 2015, as we went around the room, we discovered that several of us had stopped at just one child because we found it was just too difficult. The cost, the exhaustion, the double day of working 8 hours or more, and then coming home and doing 8 hours of care work and housework and cooking. Those of us who had male spouses were already doing more at home than they were, and the work and of rearing one child was as much as we could handle. So, and people said in some cases it was more than they could really handle. So, and then some of us who didn't have kids testified that we wanted them, but it just didn't seem feasible given our unreliable health insurance, jobs that didn't provide paid leave, or from watching our mothers struggle, we believed that it will put us into a sexist trap that would squeeze the rest of our lives. And we found our spouses were hesitant too, given their work lives and economic circumstances. And we put 16 of these testimonies in the book. So we think that all over the country, there are women like us who are blaming themselves when they want kids, but they don't see how they can make it work. They're thinking, well, if I'd gone into a better paying profession, or if I could get a job with real paid leave, if I were brave enough to quit my job and move back where my parents live, maybe they could help with childcare. In other words, we see it as something we did individually wrong. We went into too much debt for school, rather than understanding it as a system that requires our unpaid work to function. So establishment think tanks are now loudly fretting about the lower birth rate in the United States. They're worried about flagging consumer demand. They're worried about immigration and what they see as its attendant political problems. They're worried about an aging workforce causing rises in what they call entitlement spending, namely Social Security and Medicare. And they're even worried about how to keep the US military strong when both the working age tax base and the supply of young people to enlist are shrinking. So given these anxieties, the emphasis that we're seeing on the right on the family, as in the, for example, the ultra-conservative group called Focus on the Family, that makes perfect sense if by family they mean women and women's unpaid labor. Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, explained why large families are required. They make it easier to cut government programs. And here's a long quote from him that I think illustrates this. He says, "One of the things we've seen over the last 30 years is that in the absence of government programs, people aren't able to function usually as atomized individuals. You need some intermediary institutions if you're going to have small government. So you need strong families. You need people who are willing to have large families, for instance, which can then help provide for them in their old age." This is still Douthat. "If Republicans are serious about reforming Social Security or finding a way to increase the number of young workers paying into the program," he says, "then having a country with higher population growth, larger families, is an obvious and conservative way to do it." Unquote. Well, we call this program small government and big families. And, you know, to the brain trust around Focus on the Family, or people like former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, who wrote a book called It Takes a Family. You know, marriage is not about love or to face the challenges of life. It's a production unit for children. The point of marriage is to have babies. And Santorum even attacks marriage equality in his book because he thinks it will lead to lower birth rates. That's what he says. You know, also to Santorum and a lot of these people, anyone who deviates from the heterosexual marriage, lots of kids model needs to be punished to get everybody to conform. And so this seems to be an underlying motive for a lot of the anti-LGBTQ politics and discrimination that we're seeing. You know, if you wonder, like as I did a few years ago in Gainesville, Florida, when our little town was attacked from the outside with an anti-trans bathroom bill, you wonder why. What is the money behind this? I think you can see that some of it is this concern about the birth rate and trying to get everybody back into their box, the box that they want us to be in. So, well, worries about the low birth rate are not just right-wing or Republican worries. They cross the political aisle. Philip Longman of the centrist New America Foundation writes in his book, The Empty Cradle, that capitalism has never flourished except when accompanied by population growth, and it is now languishing in those parts of the world, such as Japan, Europe, and the Great Plains of the United States, where population has become stagnant, unquote. Liberal Stephen Philip Kramer of the National Defense University wrote a book in 2014 called The Other Population Crisis, What Governments Can Do About Falling Birth Rates. In it, he writes, quote, "Declining birth rates constitute a problem for the survival and security of nations in the broadest existential sense of national security. For several hundred years, economic growth has been tied to growth in population, increasing the size of the domestic market and labor force." So you can see some of their concerns. Even as these thinkers raise the alarm about low birth rates, this sea change has largely gone unnoticed by feminists. So I theorize in the book that it's because second wave feminism arose starting in the 1960s during that brief 20-year period when government planners were panicking not about low birth rates, but about high ones. They were panicking about overpopulation. And for feminists, this period is really burned into our minds because it was characterized by horrific reproductive coercion in the form of forced sterilization aimed at women receiving welfare, and primarily women of color, in particular African Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Native women. So The sterilization operation was so common that it was called a Mississippi appendectomy. And in Puerto Rico, simply it was called La Operación. The population panic and the forced sterilization that accompanied it lasted 2 decades, from the mid-50s to the mid-1970s, and it coincides with the period that the feminist movement built into a second wave. But it's a different world now. There's one abortion clinic left in Mississippi, and it operates under very restrictive rules, and in the COVID crisis, they're trying to close that. Half of the world's population now lives in countries where the birth rate is below replacement levels. And in 10 years, the United Nations projects that 67% will. But still, many feminists suspect the power structure is still preoccupied with too much population, especially among the low-aged and women of color. And that has caused us to tune out, even as establishment think tanks agonize about low birth rates, warn of worker shortages, and decry aging populations. Well, how was this ever supposed to work? Parenting has become sort of a rolling crisis. And of course, with the pandemic, we're seeing this in even more intensified form, but we were already experiencing a crisis before that. There was a moment when the union movement was strong that US employers actually put in resources towards the care and child rearing job. For a time after World War II, people expected the wages of one full-time male breadwinner to pay his expenses and those of his spouse and their children. And this was called the family wage. But starting in the 1970s, as wages stagnated and costs rose, households kept up by sending both spouses out to work, meaning that each couple is now generating 80 or more hours of work a week for employers, where it had been generating 40. The job the non-wage earning spouse used to do, child rearing, housework, caring for sick or frail family members, that is no longer included in one worker's paycheck. Instead, it's being squeezed into the few hours left in the day after paid work. Well, a family wage is sexist because it locks in discriminatory pay and it made women dependent on male breadwinners. But at least it had one progressive element, which was the employer was contributing resources towards the family care job. Well, obviously, we don't want to go back to the sexist system of the family wage, in which women are reliant on men for survival. So we argue the feminist way to arrange a care economy is to go toward a more increased social wage, which is a term used in Europe to describe services that everybody in the society gets. So the most obvious is healthcare systems where everyone is guaranteed full coverage no matter what. But also, how about a universal childcare system with a unionized workforce and national standards, free like the public schools? How about paid family leave for both parents, paid sick leave mandated by law? And how about shorter work hours? In Germany, they're working 10 extra they have 10 extra weeks off a year compared to us. So you can imagine that makes child rearing a lot easier, in addition to just enjoying your life. So immigration has been described as the American solution to the employing class's problem of lower birth rates, but it has always caused contradictions. And it's been a recurring theme of US history, as we saw in the 1870s and then at the beginning of the 20th century. Immigration and the birth rate were discussed in the same breath. If native-born women don't have more children, we'll be overrun by immigrants. And then fear of, at that time, Slavs, Jews, Catholics, and Chinese, has been replaced with fears of Latinos and Muslims and Chinese. But the alarmist claims endure. They're disloyal, they'll bring foreign ideas, an alien religion, class conflict, crime, drugs. They won't assimilate, they'll come to outnumber real Americans. All of this is a repetition of the arguments that we heard at the beginning of the 20th century. But the distaste for outsiders always seems to yield when employers need their brain and muscle. But these days, you know, Democrats largely embrace immigration as an answer to low birth rates, but the Republican establishment, as we have seen over the last few years, is split. One faction supports immigration, while the other complains that immigrants will demand government benefits, vote for Democrats, even bring class war. Even the pro-immigration side worries that the flow of immigrants is unsustainable politically, and lately they have been worrying that the supply will run out due to declining birth rates in sending countries. So pro-immigration Republicans are quite candid that they favor immigration to compensate for the low US birth rate. Ben Wattenberg, who was a part of the American Enterprise Institute before his death, wrote, a baby born 9 months from now won't even start paying into life's Ponzi scheme for a generation. And that happens only after we spend a lot of money to raise and educate the child. A quicker fix would be instant adults. As it happens, they are available, immigrants. So you can see Wattenberg is letting slip this truth that is often hidden in the immigration debate, that immigration is a colossal ripoff of the labor and resources of the mothers and parents and communities and countries that immigrants leave behind. In fact, Mexico, India, the Dominican Republic, and other sending countries are subsidizing US employers by raising these workers to adulthood. But one thing that they all agree on in the Republican Party is they don't want immigrants to have rights, either on the job or in the community. And this is why we see them favoring crackdowns that terrorize immigrant communities. At the same time, they support guest worker programs, which give employers complete control. And in keeping with their desire not to spend anything to raise and educate their workforce, both Republican factions oppose family reunification, which from their perspective brings non-workers like parents and children who might need healthcare and education. Well, just to conclude, as long as we think of this battle, the battle over reproductive rights, over abortion and birth control, primarily as a cultural conflict in which the two sides hold different worldviews, it's not really clear why corporate owners or establishment planners would have much interest one way or the other. But if we look at the battle as a fight over the production of humans, how many, how fast, and at what cost, then it seems likely that employers as a class would have an intense interest, and they would especially care when they are called upon to put in resources, as they are every time we make a demand like paid family leave or childcare. The reversal of our declining birth rate would serve an economic goal, an ever-expanding workforce raised with a minimum of public spending and a maximum of women's unpaid work. Why are employers going to pay for paid parental leave if they can get away with not providing it? Why would they pay taxes for a national childcare system if families can be induced to take that burden on themselves? But women and all parents are refusing, and this is demonstrated by our lowest ever birth rate. As the birth rate goes down, the value of our unpaid labor raising successive generations can be seen more clearly by everyone. So we think it's time to bring the battle out into the open and raise some demands. Our main demands, which come from consciousness raising in our group, are guaranteed health care, so Medicare for all type system, paid family leave for both parents. People are freaking out about 12 weeks. A lot of countries have 6 months to a year. Childcare free like the public schools, and then returning to the battle over our work hours, because they really are getting twice the work they used to get out of us. So a shorter work week for everybody, we also think needs to be on the agenda. So that's a little summary of what I go into in the book.
Thanks, Jenny. I want to return to what you were sort of describing as the central point of the book, which is that this is a material struggle over the production of humans, the production of wage workers, and the production of people who are going to join the military and work for empire. And the failure of maybe what you would say the liberal feminist movement over the last few decades to understand it in those terms. There's a lot of sort of feminist arguments that say, well, people want to curtail abortion and birth control because they're religious or because they just hate women, which is true in many cases, like those sentiments are at play, but it's maybe not, it's difficult to account for the ferocity of this fight if you only locate it in this ideological struggle. And I wonder, you know, we've seen abortion access diminished. Most poor women in the United States don't have access to a clinic, let alone being able to pay for an abortion or for reliable birth control. And so I wonder if you can describe how feminism's interpretation of this struggle has informed their political strategy, and how the more materialist account that you give in your book might give us better tools to fight back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that, you know, liberals and neoliberal representatives like Hillary Clinton want to deflect attention away from the demands that would require a big reallocation of resources. So, you know, it doesn't cost employers anything to save Roe, as they keep saying. You know, Roe is already, you know, not really the law of the land in a lot of countries just because access is such a problem. You know, but if we start talking about universal childcare and Medicare for all, or long paid leaves, that is going to go against the wishes of Democratic establishment donors who always take the side of employers and, you know, insurance companies and all the people who would not benefit from. If we have national health care, the insurance companies are going to be out of business. So, you know, even when the Democrats came under pressure to pass family leave at the behest of employers, it was unpaid. So Family and Medical Leave Act passed under Bill Clinton. It's really hard. First of all, it only covers about 50% of workers, but then it's really hard to take it if you're gonna forego a paycheck. I mean, you've just had a kid, that's when you really need the money, right? So none of these are things that the establishment is going to give up without a fight, right? And for us on the left, I think we need to draw the line and really start demanding things on a universal national basis. And I think it gives us some ammunition, because there is this sort of myth that feminists are anti-family or and I mean, that is wrong, but it also gains ammunition when, you know, when Hillary Clinton is standing up there trying to win the presidency. All that she can offer in terms of childcare is this sort of maze of acronyms and teeny little programs. She had one program for full-time working students to have childcare, and it was like a subsidy of a couple $100, and then there was a limited amount, and I was just like, why are we even like slicing and dicing this stuff? But of course, you know, she's working within a system where to be politically legitimate, you have to be against socialist or social wage or universal programs. So, you know, but people see this and they think, oh yeah, well, whatever, they're not going to give us anything that we need to raise our kids. And so both parties have really been making a disaster of family life. I mean, you know, the Democrats with their welfare reform and the Republicans with their suppression of wages. You know, clearly the goal is to get the most work out of parents for the least amount of pay of support. So I think we can become more effective if we understand that it's a fight over our work and put that up front. If we demand national programs that cover everybody, so that there's not like this resentment between the people who just don't qualify but are struggling and the people who barely qualify but are, that there's it's a patented way to divide the working class, to say, okay, you fall under this limit and therefore you get this program, and you fall over this limit and you don't get this program. And I think it also helps us better identify our enemies, right? I mean, who is the enemy in the abortion fight? Is it the grandmother with the rosary outside the clinic? Or is it the big employers and corporations and their politicians who are creating the working conditions that make it really difficult for us to have kids? Picketers have never really closed a clinic, but legislatures and judges have closed hundreds of clinics. And I think it also helps if we show that abortion is not a personal, private matter, as the liberals keep insisting, but actually really is part of our right to strike to get better working conditions for our reproductive labor. I mean, as the birth rate went down in the 20s and 30s in Sweden, that's when they started to introduce the Swedish welfare state that everybody in the US who knows about it is jealous of, right? So and I think that having those discussions will get us out of what Loretta Ross calls the stale, unproductive discussions we have around reproductive rights. And reproductive justice advocates who for the last 30 years have been saying that we don't just need abortion and birth control, we need the right to be able to have kids and the right to raise them in decent conditions, led by Black women who were really responding to the Clinton healthcare reform, and saw that it would not include everything that they needed. When we start to broaden it, as I think reproductive justice advocates have been able to do, and start looking at the whole thing, both the right to have kids, the right not to have kids, and the conditions under which we raise them, then we can see that just as in the early women's liberation movement, abortion wasn't an isolated thing. It was part of a whole general demand for freedom for women in all of these different ways, and then hooked up with the demand for racial and economic justice. So I think it helps us broaden and deepen our demands and bring people in who didn't see their interests or their concerns really addressed.
Yeah, I think that speaks to what you said in the introduction about the different ways that this control manifests. Dependent on how the capitalist state views a population, it might decide that population is important to produce more wage laborers or more settlers, or it might decide that the population is an obstacle or a threat to the status quo. In the case of, as you describe, African Americans in the sort of post-war period during the civil rights movement, or Puerto Rican women when the United States wants to dispossess and displace them. So I'm wondering if you could say more about how those divisions among women and among populations and the different ways that being subjugated under the system and controlled have created obstacles to solidarity in the reproductive rights movement. I mean, reproductive justice advocates have been talking about this for a long time, but I think those varieties of experience have presented some difficulty in how easy it is to come up with a comprehensive account of why this is happening and why it is that some women undergo forced sterilization and some women are denied sterilization until they have 6 children or whatever. So I just am interested in hearing more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the history of this. So basically, we know that enslaved women refused to bear children under slavery. Obviously, they bore some, but they resisted. And we know it because freed women testified to this. And we also know that the birth rate among formerly enslaved people went up when slavery was ended, for example, in Jamaica. So there's this history of resistance, and I mentioned the Swedish example. Also, there's a history in France of a lower birth rate leading to the state paying women to care for unwanted children. So they had foundling boxes, mostly in churches, where you would put your unwanted child, and then women figured out how to scam the system so that they could get paid to take care of the foundling that they themselves had left, right? So there's a constant struggle around getting enough for our kids, and being able to have our kids in decent conditions. But I think that when it gets divided out and in particular in the 60s, I think a lot of people see government programs as only helping the most poor, and they usually interpret that as, it didn't used to be, but now they interpret that as being women of color or even immigrants, who obviously in many cases are not actually eligible for these programs. But it means that white people in particular are seeing some of the programs that they themselves would benefit from as a bad thing, because it would benefit people who are poor or are a different race than they are. So that's one way that I think, one trick that has been played on the American people to try to keep us from supporting, and this is particularly true of white people, to keep us from supporting some of the programs that would actually help us. And then we also have these problems of getting split by, for example, natural allies, like childcare teachers and parents should be natural allies, but because it's a privatized, fragmented system, and you're paying a lot for childcare, you are pitted against the childcare teacher. You don't want to pay more for childcare. So it's really divisive, and means that we don't have a lot of political cohesion on the demand for childcare, which could be a demand where we would basically have an extension of the public schools down to age 6 months, and then have 6 months of paid leave. That would be one way to do it, and have it as a government program. But obviously the rich don't want to pay taxes for that. So politically, it's difficult to win these things, but it's further made difficult by these fragmented sort of little means tested programs where you have to qualify, and you have to be particularly hard up to get them. And then those are coded racially, and then a lot of white people won't support it. So this is a trick that is being used. Essentially, it's a racist trick that's being used that is harming both white people and people of color. And so I think those are some of the splits. I mean, the other kind of a split that we've had is parents versus non-parents. So you hear it in, like, the anti-tax commentator, why should my taxes pay for your child's school? There's a bumper sticker, can't feed them, don't breed them, that kind of anti-parent thing, which also is probably racism. And then, but you also see it in the workplace, oh, so-and-so left early to pick up her kid from childcare. How come I have to work late for, you see all these divisions. And I think part of it is that they stem from not having an understanding of the necessity of children for our society. Children are looked on as a personal project that you should take on only if you have a lot of money. And so mothers and parents in general are looked on as kind of a burden on the system, as opposed to doing needed work to raise the successive generations that we need so that our society can continue, so that we have a range of ages in our society. Now, I don't think that the right wingers who are, raising the alarm about the low birth rate are right. I think that we do need some reproduction. We don't need as much as they want. They want maximal reproduction, and they want minimal to pay for it minimally. But we do need some reproduction because we want our society to have different levels of ages, and parents are taking on that needed difficult work. But rather than people who aren't parents or aren't parents yet being grateful, they are looking on it as something where parents are getting away with something, or their expensive hobby is cramping other people's style. So and wasting taxes and all of these things. So I think those are some of the ways that we get split against each other in America right now.
I'm going to go to a couple of questions that we've gotten from people who are watching. And these two are pretty related. So the first one is, what are, other than immigration and offshoring production and restricting reproductive rights, what other sort of neo-Malthusian responses to the shrinking population do we see from the right? And the next one is, what can we anticipate, or what effect might this contracting population have on future labor markets, wages, and benefits?
Yeah, I on the second one, I have a whole chapter in the book explaining how I'm not really talking about the effect on wages of population, because it's pretty well established. I mean, there was a debate in the 19th century between Malthus, who was writing at the beginning of the 19th century, who basically said that wages were, and Adam Smith also thought this, that wages were determined by the population. And if you had a lower population, you had higher wages. It's possible that they were thinking of the Black Death, which caused, there was a period where peasants were actually able to raise their wages, but a third of the population had died. So that's rather an extreme case. But what Marx points out is that it's really not the total population availability that controls wages, but it's the relative division of people into employed and unemployed. So if you have a bunch of unemployed people, your boss can say, suck it up, and otherwise I'm just, I have a stack of applications on my desk for other people. So they can cut your wages and do all kinds of things. And if they have a reserve army of the unemployed, as he put it, and likewise, when the labor market is tight and there aren't a whole lot of unemployed people, as we have sort of experienced recently, you do start to see wages go up. But it's not the it's not the amount of babies in the pipeline that causes that. It's really a much more long-term. That's a much more long-term effect. It's the short-term effect is really the unemployment rate. So I argued with that. Now there is the argument that automation will get rid of our jobs. I've been hearing this argument for 40 years. And we went through the entire computer revolution, and then we have had, a fairly low unemployment rate recently. So I am skeptical of that argument, that automation is getting rid of jobs and we don't need the working class in the United States anymore anyway. So but I know that people argue that. I'm quite sure from reading all of these right-wing think tanks that they do not think that that automation is going to eliminate jobs, and in fact they've, they're the jobs that they are going to churn jobs with automation, and that will affect our wages because we will be knocked out of jobs where we actually unionize into jobs that aren't unionized. We'll be knocked from manufacturing into service. And that does and has affected working class life, the churning, but that doesn't mean that there are not going to be any jobs. It just means we're going to be in jobs that pay less, and that is a concern, and that's a really difficult for us to organize under those circumstances when we're constantly being kicked out of established professions and jobs that we had, and then dumped into something else. So that's, can you repeat the first question again? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. They're wondering what other responses the right wing has to the contracting population besides restricting birth control and abortion and using immigration or offshoring. Like, are there other tactics that they are trying to implement to deal with this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Those are the main ones that I'm aware of. Obviously, where wages go up, they want to automate. So that's one of the things that they do. They're also playing mind games to try to get us to have more kids, and trying to promote motherhood and the sacredness of the family, and have people, the lack of birth control and abortion, have people get married in order to be able to have sex. This is their old style idea of the family. I think they're not going to get that one back in the box. But they have forever promoted this idea of femininity and women being these carers and all of these, trying to get women back into the traditional role of doing a lot of work for free. So I think that could be counted as another tactic that they've been using.
When you spoke about the sort of consciousness raising work that you've done to talk to the organizers that you knew about their individual experiences having children or not having children, and the struggle that they've had in these incredibly hostile working conditions. And there's a section in the book that has kind of a list of these sorts of consciousness raising questions that are really great. But I'm wondering what other ideas or thoughts do you have about how we can collectivize and politicize these disparate individual experiences with reproductive labor? I'm really interested in, the idea of just calling it a strike or work slowdown. Are there other examples you can point to of similar, like, refusals of work or strikes whose political character wasn't recognized or maybe took a while to be uncovered?
Well, we were discussing earlier, during the Civil War, W.B. Du Bois regards that as the first general strike where enslaved people refused work, and really had a giant effect on the Southern plantation system. So that's there are a lot of cases where people are refusing work, and it is not character. I think people do not think of that, until Du Bois, they did not think of that as a labor strike. So that's a great example of it. The idea of, when we talked about this, we thought, now, can we call a strike? Should we, you know, and then we realized, wait, we're already on a strike. And we've already had we already have the low. I mean, if we had called a strike 10 years ago, we would think we had been fabulously successful because people, you know, the birth rate is the lowest it's ever been and it's been going down. I mean, they thought that after the Great Recession, it would come back up, but it hasn't. It's continued to plunge because our conditions are still so difficult. The time and the resources that we need to, and space, you know, housing. I mean, all of these things, when we try to think about having kids, it's still so difficult. So, so we didn't really think we needed to call a strike. We thought, okay, we're already on one. And that was a big realization that we got through consciousness raising, because we sort of knew that, oh gosh, that, you know, parenting is being hard. My friends are really stressed and having big trouble doing this. But when we actually went around the room and started talking about it, people were in tears about, like, they wanted to have a larger family. They all, you know, they had a sister that they loved. They wanted their daughter to have a sibling, you know, that relationship. It didn't seem like a full family without two. And yet they couldn't figure out how to make it work. So I think a lot of people, part of the idea with consciousness raising is that you compare your experiences and you discover that things that you thought were your own shortcomings, or you just hadn't figured out the right way to do things, everybody has those same problems, or they've tried a different strategy and it also hasn't worked. And that's when you start to realize, okay, this is a systemic problem. It's only going to be solved by us uniting and changing the system in a fundamental way. But it's also really therapeutic to it takes the pressure off us, because we're blaming ourselves. When you stop blaming yourself so much, it's always hard. It's hard not to blame yourself. You're always going to feel some of that. But when you start to see the systemic roots of it, you start to get angry at the right people rather than being angry at yourself. Or, you know, I mean, the mommy wars where stay-at-home moms are mad at moms who go to work, moms who go to work are mad at stay-at-home moms. All of this stuff, what we really need to be looking at is what is a system that could work for all of us, you know, and consciousness raising helps us understand that it is not just an individual choice that we made that's not working. One example is, you know, comparing experience between moms that went full-time at home, did part-time work, or continued to work. None of these solutions is adequate. The stay-at-home mom is made dependent on the breadwinner, which is usually a guy. So he also has the weight of male supremacy on his side. The part-timer is both doesn't have as much money, but also is, you know, juggling everything at home. And then when you're trying to work full-time and raise kids, you're just constantly short of time, constantly on the run. You barely have time to think. It's just exhausting. So, and of course, now people are trying to juggle all this in 600 square feet, at least in New York they are, with the kids and the job and 2 jobs. and we can see just how ridiculous it is. But even before that, we were in these situations. And when you start comparing that with other people who have the same experiences and can compare it, you realize, yeah, the system is not set up to, the system is deliberately set up to keep us running, keep us going crazy. We are taking on the burdens of a system that doesn't work right now. And so we have to put the burdens back onto those who benefit, which is primarily employers and the rich in this country.
So we have one more question. I think that might be the last question we take, because I think we're probably going to wrap it up soon. But this person's wondering, what has been the reaction of organizations like Planned Parenthood or other like establishment reproductive rights organizations to the kinds of socialized universal demands that you call for in the book?
Well, Planned Parenthood is very like in its own lane about abortion and birth control in the clinics. I don't think they have really broadened out. Now, the National Organization for Women, which is, you know, mainstream liberal feminist organization and has the strength of being a membership-based organization, they're funded by dues primarily, has been for national healthcare since the 80s. So they have had that position, but they, and I'm a member, so maybe I should say we, but I was not involved in the decisions where they endorsed Elizabeth Warren in the election. And then when Elizabeth Warren dropped out, they urged her not to endorse Bernie Sanders. Now this goes against, you know, Sanders has 100% record on Now's issues and has repeatedly been supported by Now throughout his political career because he's a good feminist and he's better on these issues like the Hyde Amendment than, for example, Hillary Clinton or certainly Joe Biden. So it's sort of extraordinary. And I think that's what's happened is that some feminist organizations have sort of become wrapped up in the Democratic Party establishment in this sort of patronage type system. So they're no longer really paying attention to what women on the ground need as much as what their organization needs. So that is really disappointing to me because, you know, I'm a lifelong Now member and it's, you know, I urge Now to come back to the basic stuff that Now stood for when it was first founded. I mean, Betty Friedan famously said, "Without childcare, it's all just talk." You know, so we need to get back to some of the basic feminist demands that for this universal stuff. You know, childcare, healthcare, paid leave. These are absolutely required for us to continue and gain support and make feminism a vibrant part of the movement for freedom, which is what feminism has always been.
Yeah. On that note, do you have any thoughts or concluding points that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah. So with the Birth Strike book, we developed a study guide in addition to the questions that are in the back. You can, if you're interested in doing a consciousness raising group, we have study questions, consciousness raising questions, how to do it. And that's on our website, womensliberation.org has that study guide you can download. And National Women's Liberation, which is a dues-funded feminist group. We are not beholden to corporations or their foundations, which we think is really important because we're going to be criticizing. We have to be independent, and we have roots in the 60s women's liberation movement, specifically two groups, Gainesville, Florida Women's Liberation and Red Stockings of the women's liberation movement. So we have, when feminism was part of the left and was very radical, that is the sort of the tradition that we come out of. And we also have a Women of Color caucus, which meets even before the pandemic, was meeting remotely. So if you are a woman of color and you're interested in that, the idea of the Women of Color caucus is to look at the ways that racism and white supremacy and male supremacy work together. And there's information on the Women of Color caucus on our website too, womensliberation.org. So And we are a dues-funded feminist group. We would love for your membership. That we're trying to increase our base and start new chapters in new cities. So if you're interested in that, definitely contact us.
Thanks so much, Jenny.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, both of you, for an interesting discussion that I hate to see end. I'm here to make a donor pitch, but I think I'll ask a question instead, just to extend the discussion maybe a little longer, even though after it's ended. You know, you present a fight over labor. You describe a fight over labor that presents itself as something else, a moral question or so forth. But now during the pandemic, we've seen this craving for work and for getting people back to work come out nakedly and declare itself in a way that's almost shocking, since we're used to having it transform itself or clothe itself in other guises and moral guises. Do you think this will have any kind of effect on how people perceive all of these other covert attempts to get people back working and to keep working again and again and keeping the wheels of capital turning?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think it's been quite educational that the government can send everybody a check, that you know, we can apparently we're expected to work at home with kids, and the moms of my acquaintance have been spending, you know, basically full time dealing with all the little logging in and logging out of all the different programs that they're required to log into to do education. I mean, we're expected to be equally productive while we're in the middle of this. And then the push for people to return to work is just, it really is naked. And it really shows that they don't care about our lives. They don't care about our health. So yes, I think it is exposing some things about this. About the trick is how do we make that exposure into something where people have hope that they can change things, because I think, you know, a lot of people, everybody knows there's something wrong with the system. It's just that we have to have some sense of how do we transform this into something that we can that's livable for us. And I think a lot of people have you know, have this sense that you can't change, you know, you can't fight City Hall, you can't change things. So how do we make that into a moving movement? And I've been very impressed by and participated in the Bernie Sanders campaign, as you know, partly it was just a national consciousness raising session on, you know, you are not the only person who is struggling and is unable to make ends meet in this system. And, you know, I think that for what the Bernie campaign did was allow people to really understand that they weren't alone and that it wasn't their fault, which is, you know, the first step, I think. But then we also need to coalesce into, you know, a fighting force that can make these changes. So that's the agenda, right?
I think that's a good thought to end on. Again, thanks very much for a really enjoyable discussion. Let me make a pitch for all those who enjoy Red May and are looking forward to some of our other discussions, like carceral capitalism tomorrow night at 6 p.m. with Jackie Wang and Dan Berger. We need your help. Reach into your pockets or pull out your cards and copy the numbers down. Call Fan the Flames of Red May, or go to our website, redmayseattle.org, and click on the donate button and join us throughout the month in this prodigal and excessive festival of left every day. And after we take over the month of May, who knows, eventually we'll take over all the months. but right now May is at least a good goal that we can achieve together here. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Katherine Armitage and Jenny Brown.
Thanks.
Thank you.